The rain on Earth had always smelled like wet concrete and old memories, a scent that Julian Thorne associated with bad luck and missed opportunities. He was a man who lived his life in the margins, a junior archivist for a museum that nobody visited, spending his days cataloging pottery shards from civilizations that had forgotten how to smile. Julian was not a hero. He was barely a protagonist in his own life. He was 32, wore sweaters that were slightly too large, and possessed a nervous habit of adjusting his glasses even when they were perfectly straight. It was this very habit, this mundane twitch of human anxiety, that led him to stand under the awning of a closed bakery in downtown Seattle, shaking water from his hair, when the sky tore open. It did not tear with thunder or lightning, but with a sound like silk ripping, a high-pitched whine that vibrated in Julian's teeth. A beam of light, not white but a shimmering, iridescent violet, struck the pavement 3 feet away from him. There was no explosion, only a sudden displacement of air that knocked Julian onto his backside, ruining his trousers and scattering his grocery bag of apples across the wet asphalt. From the crater of light emerged a figure that defied every logical explanation Julian's archivist mind could muster. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with skin the color of a deep, twilight ocean and hair like spun moonlight, cascading down her back in thick, white waves. She wore armor that looked like it was grown rather than forged, organic plates of silver and blue that shifted with her breathing. Her eyes were large, devoid of whites, and glowed with a soft, amber luminescence. She looked at Julian, then at the apples rolling into the gutter, and let out a sigh that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. She spoke, but the words were not English. There were a melodic cascade of tones that Julian somehow understood in the center of his chest. She said she was lost. She said she was dying. And she said, with a desperation that bridged the gap between species, that she needed a witness. Julian, being a man who could not leave a stray cat in the rain, let alone a 7-foot alien woman bleeding luminous blue blood onto his shoes, helped her up. He did not know that her name was Lyra Vael, the high healer of the Zenthri Empire, nor did he know that the wound on her side was inflicted by a plasma dagger coated in neurotoxin. He only knew that she was heavy, warm, and terrifyingly beautiful. He dragged her into his small, cluttered apartment, ignoring the stares of his neighbors, and spent the next 6 hours cleaning her wound with hydrogen peroxide and wrapping it in every clean towel he owned. Lyra watched him with an intensity that made Julian's skin prickle. She did not speak much, but her eyes followed his every move, studying his hands, his face, the way he hummed off-key while he worked. When the fever broke, she sat up, the blue glow of her skin brightening, and touched his cheek. Her fingers were cool, smooth as polished stone. She whispered a word that sounded like bond, and before Julian could ask what she meant, the door to his apartment dissolved into dust. Standing in the hallway were 3 figures clad in black armor, their faces hidden behind masks of obsidian glass. They held weapons that hummed with malicious energy. Lyra Vael moved faster than thought. She shoved Julian behind her, her hands glowing with a fierce, white light. The battle that ensued was short, brutal, and silent, save for the crackle of energy and the thud of bodies hitting the floor. When it was over, Lyra turned to Julian, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and told him that she had inadvertently initiated a marriage ritual by accepting his aid and allowing him to touch her blood. In Zenthri culture, to heal someone was to share life. To be healed by a stranger was to owe them everything. But to allow a stranger to tend to your wounds while you were vulnerable was to offer yourself as a partner. It was an ancient law, one that had been forgotten by most, but not by the royal court. And unfortunately for Julian, the royal court was already on its way. The journey to the Zenthri homeworld was a blur of nausea and wonder. Julian was shoved onto a ship that looked like a teardrop made of mercury, piloted by a droid that communicated exclusively in sarcasm. Lyra explained, as best she could through the language barrier in Julian's panic, that she was the primary healer to Queen Isolde, the ruler of the Zenthri Dominion, a galaxy-spanning empire that valued order above all else. Lyra was also the queen's niece, a fact she had omitted in her delirium. The marriage bond, while accidental, was legally binding under the old codes, which meant Julian was now technically the consort of a high-ranking noble. This was problematic because the Zenthri did not intermarry with other species, especially not with soft-skinned, short-lived mammals from backwater planets. As they approached the capital planet, Ethelgard, Julian saw a world that looked like a jewel suspended in space. Cities of crystal spiraled into the clouds, connected by bridges of light. Ships moved in perfect, synchronized patterns, like schools of fish. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly intimidating. When they landed at the royal palace, a structure so vast it had its own weather system, Julian was greeted not by fanfare, but by silence. Hundreds of guards lined the landing platform, their spears lowered. At the center stood Queen Isolde, a woman who looked like Lyra but older, colder, her white hair pulled back into a severe bun, her blue skin marked with intricate tattoos of gold. Beside her stood Lord Vex, the Chancellor, a man with sharp features and eyes that calculated Julian's worth and found it lacking. Vex sneered, calling Julian a pet and demanding that the bond be annulled immediately. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady, declaring that the bond was sealed by the old blood and could only be broken by death or divorce, the latter of which required a trial by combat. Julian, standing in his ruined sneakers and borrowed jacket, felt his knees knock together. He wanted to go home. He wanted his archives. He wanted to never see another alien again. But Lyra looked at him, and for the first time, he saw fear in her amber eyes. She was not just protecting herself. She was protecting him. If the bond was annulled by force, Julian would be executed as a contaminant. If they fought, he would die. There was only one option: stay, pretend, and hope for a miracle. Life in the palace was a nightmare of etiquette and espionage. Julian was given quarters that were larger than his entire apartment building, filled with furniture that adjusted to his body temperature and windows that showed views of nebulae instead of streets. He was assigned a staff of droids who criticized his posture and a tailor who wept at the sight of his cotton socks. Lyra visited him daily, bringing him food that tasted like spices he couldn't name and explaining the complex web of Zenthru politics. The Empire was dying, she told him, though no one else would admit it. A plague known as the Grey Rot was spreading through the outer rims, turning crops to ash and people to stone. The Queen's healers were powerless against it. Lyra believed the answer lay in the ancient texts, the same ones Julian had spent his life studying on Earth. She had seen his knowledge, his ability to connect disparate pieces of history, and she believed he could find a cure where her science had failed. Julian was skeptical. He was an archivist, not a doctor. But Lyra insisted, and slowly, a partnership formed. They spent hours in the Royal Library, a cavernous room filled with floating data crystals. Julian taught Lyra about Earth's history, about resilience and adaptation, while Lyra taught him about Zenthru biology, about the flow of energy through living things. They laughed together, a rare and precious thing in the cold palace. Julian made fun of the droid pretentiousness, and Lyra taught him how to dance the traditional Zenthru waltz, a dance that involved hovering 3 inches off the ground. For the first time in his life, Julian felt useful. He felt seen, and perhaps, dangerously, he began to feel something more for the alien Queen's healer. But the palace was not a safe haven. Lord Vex was plotting. He believed that the Grey Rot was not a disease, but a weapon, one that he had engineered to weaken the Queen's hold on the outer rim so he could seize power. He knew that Lyra was close to finding a cure, and he knew that Julian was the key. Vex began to sabotage their efforts, deleting data files, poisoning Julian's food, and spreading rumors that the human was a spy for a rival empire. The tension in the palace grew thick enough to cut. Queen Isolde watched them with unreadable eyes, neither supporting nor condemning them. She was a ruler who valued strength, and she was waiting to see if Julian would break. Julian did not break. Instead, he adapted. He used his archival skills to track the inconsistencies in the medical reports, noticing patterns that the Zenthru doctors had missed. He realized that the Grey Rot was not attacking the body, but the spirit, feeding on fear and despair. It was a psychic plague, one that thrived in the rigid, emotionless society of the Zenthru. The cure, he hypothesized, was not a chemical, but an emotional resonance, a frequency of hope that could disrupt the rot's hold. It was a ridiculous theory, one that sounded like magic rather than science. But Lyra believed him. She trusted him. And together, they began to craft a device, a resonator that could amplify the emotional frequency of a living being. The climax arrived during the Festival of Stars, a celebration of the Zenthru founding. The entire royal court was gathered in the Grand Hall, a dome of transparent aluminum that offered a view of the cosmos. Lord Vex chose this moment to strike. He activated the Grey Rot within the palace itself, releasing a cloud of gray mist that swept through the crowd. Panic erupted. The Zenthru, unaccustomed to fear, froze. Their skin turned gray, their movement stiffened. Queen Isolde fell to her knees, her golden tattoos fading. Vex stood on the balcony, laughing, his mask removed to reveal a face twisted by ambition. He declared himself emperor and ordered the guards to arrest Lyra and Julian. But Julian was ready. He had installed the resonator in the central pillar of the hall, disguised as a decorative sculpture. He grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the pillar. "We have to activate it," he shouted over the chaos. "It needs a source, a strong emotional source." Lyra looked at him, understanding dawn in her eyes. The resonator needed love, or at least, the profound connection they had formed. It needed the bond that Vex sought to destroy. They ran, dodging blasts from Vex loyalists, their hands clasped tight. Julian's heart pounded, not just with fear, but with a clarity he had never known. He loved her, not because she was an alien queen's healer, not because she was beautiful, but because she had seen him, truly seen him, when no one else had. And he knew, with a certainty that shook his soul, that she loved him too. They reached the pillar, but Vex was there, blocking their path. He held a plasma rifle, aimed directly at Julian's chest. End of the line, pet. Vex sneered. Julian did not flinch. He looked at Lyra, and then at Vex. You're wrong, Julian said, his voice calm. This isn't about power. It's about connection. He stepped in front of Lyra, shielding her with his body. It was a foolish, human gesture, one that made no sense in Zenthri logic. Why protect the weak? Why sacrifice oneself for another? Vex hesitated, confused by the irrationality of the act. In that second of hesitation, Lyra pushed Julian aside and slammed her hand onto the resonator. She poured her energy into it, her love for Julian, her hope for her people, her grief for the dying. The machine hummed, a low, vibrating sound that grew louder, deeper. A wave of white light exploded from the pillar, washing over the hall. The gray mist dissipated. The Zenthri stopped freezing. Their skin regained its blue hue. Queen Isolde stood up, her eyes blazing with renewed strength. Vex screamed as the light hit him, not burning him, but stripping away his hatred, leaving him hollow and defeated. He collapsed, his weapon clattering to the floor. The aftermath was quiet. The palace was in disarray, but the people were alive. Queen Isolde approached Julian and Lyra, her expression unreadable. She looked at Julian, really looked at him. For the first time, she saw the fear, yes, but also the courage. She saw the archivist who had saved an empire not with a sword, but with a song. She bowed her head, a gesture of respect rarely given to outsiders. The bond stands, she said, her voice echoing in the silent hall. And the human is no longer a pet. He is a prince consort. Julian blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Lyra squeezed his hand, her smile brighter than the stars outside. They had won. They had saved the galaxy. But as Julian looked around at the faces of the Zenthri, he realized that the real work was just beginning. The gray rut was gone, but the fear remained. The rigidity of their society had been cracked, and now they had to rebuild. Julian was no longer just an observer of history. He was a part of it. He was a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of change. And he was married to an alien queen's healer who had stolen his heart along with his freedom. In the weeks that followed, Julian's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. He was no longer the shy archivist from Seattle. He was a public figure, a subject of fascination and controversy. Some Zenthri revered him as a savior, others despised him as a contaminant. But Julian handled it with the same quiet dignity he had used to catalog pottery shards. He started a new archive, one that included Earth's history alongside Zenthri records. He taught the Zenthri about art, about music, about the beauty of imperfection. He showed them that emotions were not weaknesses, but strengths. Lyra continued her work as a healer, but now she had a partner. They worked together, combining Earth's holistic approaches with Zenthri technology. They traveled to the outer rims, helping those affected by the gray rot, not just physically, but emotionally. Julian learned to speak Zenthri fluently, his accent charming the locals. Lyra learned to laugh, really laugh, a sound that startled the droids and delighted the queen. Their relationship deepened, evolving from an accidental bond into a genuine partnership. They argued, they compromised, they grew. Julian taught Lyra how to make apple pie, using apples synthesized in the palace labs. Lyra taught Julian how to fly a skiff, a lesson that ended with them crashing into a fountain, soaked and laughing. But peace is fragile, and the galaxy is vast. Rumors began to circulate of a new threat, a faction of Zenthri purists who rejected Julian's influence. They called themselves the Pew Bloods, and they believed that the Empire had been weakened by the introduction of human ideas. Lord Vex, though imprisoned, was still pulling strings from his cell, whispering poison into the ears of the discontented. Julian knew that the danger was not over. He knew that his presence was a catalyst for change, and change always brings resistance. One evening, as he and Lyra sat on the balcony of their quarters, watching the twin moons rise, Lyra turned to him. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice soft. Julian looked at her, at the woman who had fallen from the sky and changed his life. He thought about his old life, the quiet loneliness, the safety of the margins. Then he thought about the chaos, the danger, the love. "Yes," he said, "I am." And he meant it. He was no longer just Julian Thorne, the archivist. He was Julian, the human, the husband, the savior. And he was ready for whatever came next. The story of Julian and Lyra became a legend, told in schools and sung in bars across the galaxy. It was a story of unlikely love, of courage in the face of odds, of the power of connection. But for Julian, it was simply his life. He woke up every morning next to a blue-skinned woman with white hair, drank coffee that tasted slightly of ozone, and went to work to build a better future. He missed the rain sometimes, the smell of wet concrete. But he had found a new home, not just in a palace, but in a heart. And as he looked out at the stars, he knew that the universe was vast and mysterious, but it was also full of possibility. He had accidentally married an alien queen's healer and saved the galaxy. But more importantly, he had saved himself. He had found his place in the cosmos, not as a spectator, but as a participant. And that, he decided, was the greatest adventure of all. The pure bloods would come. He knew. Vex would plot. The galaxy would continue to spin, chaotic and unpredictable. But Julian was ready. He had his archives, his skills, and his wife. And together, they would face whatever came next, one step at a time, hand in hand, under the watchful eyes of the stars. The end was not in sight, but the journey was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, Julian Thorne was excited to see where it would lead. The peace that settled over Ethelgard was deceptive, a thin veneer of calm painted over deep, structural cracks in the Zenthri society. Julian Thorne had spent the last 6 months trying to bridge the cultural divide, teaching the rigid, emotion-suppressing Zenthri that vulnerability was not a defect but a feature of sentient life. He had introduced therapy hours in the palace gardens, where nobles sat on cushions and talked about their feelings, a concept that initially horrified the court but eventually became a trendy, if awkward, social ritual. Lyra Vael supported him fully, her status as the high healer giving weight to his unconventional methods. However, the Purebloods, the faction led by the imprisoned Lord Vex remaining loyalists, were not idle. They operated in the shadows, whispering that the human influence was a virus more dangerous than the Grey Rot. They claimed that Julian's presence was destabilizing the psychic equilibrium of the planet, causing unpredictable weather patterns and minor technological glitches. It was propaganda, pure and simple, but it was effective. The Zenthri people, who valued order above all else, began to look at Julian with suspicion rather than admiration. The first major twist came during the annual equinox ceremony, an event where the Queen renewed her bond with the planet's core energy. As Queen Isolde stood on the dais, channeling the planetary resonance, the ground beneath the palace began to shake. Not a violent earthquake, but a rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat gone wrong. The lights in the grand hall flickered and died, replaced by an eerie, red emergency glow. From the shadows of the colonnades emerged figures clad in the old, ceremonial armor of the Zenthri Guard, armor that had been retired centuries ago. They were not attacking, they were kneeling. But their leader, a tall, scarred warrior named Kalen, stepped forward and declared that the Queen had lost the mandate of the heavens. He claimed that the human contamination had severed the link between the royal bloodline and the planet spirit. Kalen was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a true believer, a man who loved his empire so much he was willing to destroy it to save its soul. He demanded that Julian be exiled immediately, or the palace would be sealed off, trapping the royal family inside while the outer cities descended into chaos. Queen Isolde looked ready to order his execution, her eyes hard as flint, but Lyra stepped in. She argued that exile would prove the Purebloods right, that humans were disposable. Instead, she proposed a trial of resonance, an ancient and nearly forgotten ritual where the accused and the accuser would enter the planet's core chamber, a sacred space beneath the palace, and allow the planet itself to judge their worthiness. If the planet rejected Julian, he would leave voluntarily. If it accepted him, the Purebloods would disband. It was a gamble of astronomical proportions. No human had ever entered the core chamber. The psychic pressure alone was said to crush the minds of lesser beings. Julian, terrified but refusing to let Lyra face this alone, agreed. The crowd gasped. Even Queen Isolde looked pale. But there was no other way to stop the impending civil war. The descent into the core chamber was a journey into madness. The elevator dropped for miles, passing through layers of rock and crystal that hummed with raw energy. When the doors opened, Julian and Kalen stepped into a cavern that defied physics. The air was thick with light, swirling in colors that had no names. In the center floated a sphere of pure energy, the heart of Ethelgard. Kalen approached it first, placing his hands on the barrier. The sphere glowed blue, steady and strong. The planet accepted him. Then it was Julian's turn. He walked forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the weight of billions of minds pressing against his own, judging him, analyzing him. He felt small, insignificant, a speck of dust in a universe of giants. He reached out, his trembling fingers touching the energy field. Immediately, pain shot through his body. It wasn't physical pain. It was emotional. The planet showed him his fears, his insecurities, his loneliness. It showed him the faces of everyone who had ever doubted him. It tried to break him, but Julian did not fight back. He did not try to impose his will on the planet, as the Zenthri did. Instead, he listened. He remembered his days in the archive, the quiet joy of discovering a forgotten truth. He remembered the rain in Seattle. He remembered Lyra's laugh. He projected these memories into the sphere, not as weapons, but as gifts. He showed the planet that humanity was not just chaos and noise, but also resilience and love. He showed the planet that difference was not a threat, but a source of strength. The sphere pulsed, turning from a harsh white to a warm, golden hue. The pain subsided, replaced by a sensation of warmth, like being wrapped in a blanket. The planet accepted him, not because he was powerful, but because he was authentic. Kalen stayed in disbelief, his faith shaken. The trial was over. Julian had won, however. The victory was short-lived. As they ascended back to the surface, alarms blared throughout the palace. Lord Vex, from his prison cell, had managed to hack into the palace's defense grid. He hadn't just been plotting. He had been building a weapon. A satellite orbiting the planet, ostensibly for weather control, had been reprogrammed to fire a concentrated beam of negative psychic energy at the palace. The goal was not to kill the queen, but to lobotomize the entire royal court, leaving them as empty shells that Vex could control. The beam struck just as Julian and Kalen emerged from the elevator. The impact knocked everyone off their feet. The psychic backlash was immediate and devastating. People screamed, clutching their heads. Queen Isolde collapsed, her mind overwhelmed by the influx of dark energy. Lyra rushed to her aunt's side, but she too was affected, her glowing skin dimming to a dull gray. Julian, shielded by the residual energy of the core chamber, was the only one still standing. He saw Vex's face on the main screen, smiling triumphantly. Order requires silence, Vex whispered, and I will give you eternal silence. Julian knew he couldn't fight Vex with force. He couldn't hack the satellite. He wasn't a technician, but he was an archivist. He knew history. He knew that the Zenthri defense grid was based on ancient harmonic frequencies, designed to resonate with the royal bloodline. If he could amplify the Queen's natural frequency, he could override the satellite signal. But the Queen was unconscious. He needed a proxy. He needed someone with a strong enough connection to the royal line to act as a conduit. He looked at Lyra, struggling to stay conscious. He looked at Kalen, who was staring at him with a mix of shame and awe. And then he looked at himself. He was not of royal blood, but he was bonded to Lyra. And through her, he was connected to the Queen. I need your help, Julian shouted to Kalen. I need you to protect me while I do this. Kalen hesitated, then nodded. He drew his sword and stood guard as Julian ran to the central console. Julian didn't know how to operate the complex Zenthri interface, but he remembered something Lyra had told him. The system responded to intent, not just input. He placed his hands on the console and closed his eyes. He thought of Lyra. He thought of their dance, their arguments, their shared meals. He poured every ounce of his love for her into the machine. He visualized the bond between them, a golden thread connecting his heart to hers, and from Hayes to the Queen's. He pushed that image into the network. The console sparked. Lights flashed. The satellite's beam wavered. Vex's smile faded. Impossible, Vex muttered. A human cannot interface with the royal grid. But I'm not just a human, Julian gritted out, blood trickling from his nose. I'm family. The golden light erupted from the console, shooting up through the ceiling, piercing the atmosphere, and striking the satellite. The satellite overloaded, exploding in a silent burst of light in the upper atmosphere. The psychic pressure lifted. The palace fell silent. Then, slowly, people began to stare. Queen Isolde opened her eyes. Lyra sat up, her skin glowing bright blue again. Kalen lowered his sword, looking at Julian with a newfound respect. Vex, watching from his cell, slumped in defeat. He had underestimated the power of connection. He had forgotten that love is the most chaotic, unpredictable, and powerful force in the universe. In the weeks that followed, the Zenthri Empire underwent a transformation. The Pure Bloods disbanded, their ideology shattered by the events. Kalen became the new head of security, tasked with protecting the new order. Lord Vex was sentenced to permanent exile on a remote moon, where he would have plenty of time to reflect on his failures. Queen Isolde, humbled by her near-death experience, announced a new era of openness. She invited Earth diplomats to Ethelgard, establishing formal trade and cultural exchange programs. Julian was no longer seen as an outsider, but as a hero, a symbol of the union between two worlds. He was given the title of Grand Archivist of the Galaxy, a position that allowed him to travel the stars, collecting stories and histories from every species in the Dominion. But the biggest change was personal. Lyra and Julian moved out of the palace, choosing to live in a smaller house on the outskirts of the capital, near the gardens where they had first started their therapy sessions. They wanted a normal life, as normal as it could be for an alien queen's healer and a human archivist. They adopted a pet, a small, furry creature from the outer rims that looked like a cross between a cat and a cloud. They hosted dinner parties for nobles and commoners alike, serving apple pie and Zenthri nectar. They argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes, and they laughed when the droids complained about the mess point one evening. As they sat on their porch watching the twin moons rise, Lyra turned to Julian. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Leaving Earth? Giving up your old life?" Julian smiled, taking her hand. He thought about the rainy streets of Seattle, the quiet archives, the loneliness. Then he looked at Lyra, at the woman who had fallen from the sky and changed everything. He thought about the friends they had made, the lives they had saved, the galaxy they had helped to heal. "No," he said, "I don't regret a thing. I found my home. I found my purpose. And I found you." Lyra leaned her head on his shoulder, her white hair mixing with his dark curls. "And I found mine," she whispered. The story of Julian and Lyra became a legend, not just of salvation, but of integration. It taught the Zenthri that strength lies not in uniformity, but in diversity. It taught humanity that they were not alone in the universe, and that they had something valuable to offer. And for Julian, it was a reminder that sometimes, the best things in life are the ones we're never planned for. He had accidentally married an alien queen's healer and saved the galaxy. But in doing so, he had saved himself. He had learned to be brave, to be open, to be loved. And as he looked out at the stars, twinkling like diamonds in the velvet sky, he knew that their adventure was far from over. There were other planets to visit, other cultures to understand, other stories to tell. But for now, in the quiet comfort of their home, with the woman he loved by his side, Julian Thorne was exactly where he was meant to be. The galaxy was vast, but his world was perfect, and that was enough.